touch anything. Who else is home?
What's going on? What the hell is going on?
Listen to what my colleague's got to say. Right, you're under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to kidnap. You do not have to say anything.
What is going on? What are you talking about?
Mention one question, something which relates to line for anything you do say may begin with.
Can you tell me what you're talking about?
You're getting new, babe. Alright.
You are very gentle.
Necessities for the arrest are to allow for a prompt and effective investigation by interview and to prevent any further physical harm to the person. Okay, we'll talk about it back.
To who? Can you please explain to me what the hell is going on?
So, at the moment, you're under arrest for conspiracy to kidnap.
Who?
Holly Willoughby.
I don't think those ones are warm.
That's the allegation.
Okay, where's that come from?
Like I said, it'll be explained to you in custody, and you'll be interviewed about it. I'm not going to tell you any further than that at this current time, okay?
Okay then.
But that is the allegation.
I'm not going to lie, she's a fantasy of mine. I mean, she's a fantasy of a lot of guys, isn't she? Right, okay.
This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. For over a decade, if you lived in the UK and turned on your TV before lunchtime, you'd be met with the same familiar image. A sunny studio, cheerful chatter, and at the centre of it all, Holly Willoughby. Blonde, bright-eyed, and dressed to perfection, Holly wasn't just a presenter, she was a household name. A kind of national sister, daughter, and best friend all rolled into one. The kind of person tabloids obsessed over, but the public adored. And she made it look effortless. The laughter, the empathy, the glossy professionalism that never seemed to slip. But she also had this really amazing ability to seem super relatable, genuine and down to earth. And I think that's why she resonated so strongly with such a wide array of people, of viewers. But as you're about to learn, just beneath that polished image, right under the surface, things were starting to crack. And no one, not even Holly, saw what was coming next. Before she became a familiar face on daytime TV, Holly's story began in Brighton, East Sussex. At just 14 years old, she was scouted by a modelling agency at the Clothes Show Live, the kind of teen dream moment most kids only imagine. She signed with Storm Management, the same agency that first started working with Kate Moss, and within weeks, Holly was everywhere. Covers of Ms., Just 17, Shout, and more. Teen Bibles of the time. But Holly's ambition didn't stop at modelling. She had that infectious, TV-friendly warmth. And by 2004, she'd landed a role co-hosting Ministry of Mayhem on CITV. This really loud, chaotic Saturday morning show full of gunge and games. It was fun, silly, and the kind of gig that could be a stepping stone. And for Holly, it really was just the beginning. In 2006, she made the jump to primetime ITV, co-presenting Dancing on Ice with Philip Schofield, a man nearly 20 years her senior, and a well-established name. The chemistry between them was instant, and that friendship that they started really became something that viewers would want to see for the coming years. It was on the 4th of August 2007 that Holly married a man called Dan Baldwin. He was a former producer on Ministry of Mayhem that she worked on, and later an executive producer on Celebrity Juice. The couple lived in Barnes, London, and had 2 sons and a daughter. And meanwhile, Holly's career was flourishing. Her and Phil's friendship moved over to This Morning in 2009, a daytime talk show kind of reporting on news, weather, but also anything else really. Actually, it might not have even had weather, but it was a kind of everything show. And on this show together, they became an institution. Ratings soared, awards rolled in. And Holly, while she was doing this, also became team captain on Celebrity Juice. She was funny, relatable, slightly chaotic, but still polished and proper. The perfect mix. But behind the scenes, things weren't quite as picture perfect. By 2023, cracks in the facade began to show, and fast. It started subtly. Social media speculation, industry whispers. Something was off at This Morning. Philip Schofield, once the golden boy of ITV, was now the subject of serious scrutiny. Rumours swirled about his behaviour behind the scenes, about toxic culture, mistreatment of crew members, and an inappropriate relationship with a much younger male colleague, reportedly a showrunner who had worked on the show as a teen. Then came the scandal that changed everything. In March 2023, it was revealed that Philip's brother, Timothy Schofield, was facing trial for 11 sexual offences involving a child. The headlines were relentless, and while Holly remained stoic and composed on screen, her longtime co-host vanished. Phil took a leave of absence during the trial, and Holly began presenting with a kind of rotation of guest hosts. But the situation was spiralling. Timothy Schofield was found guilty and he was sentenced to prison. And barely a few weeks later, early April, Phil decided to return to work. But this wasn't for long, because that professional partnership was over. And it was the kind of a culmination of a few things that I have spoken about, things I haven't spoken about as well. If you're in the UK, you probably are aware of the other things. There was this Q-gate thing when the Queen passed away and they had press passes but were seen as kind of like skipping the queue. I don't really want to get into the detail of it because I actually don't think it's very important in the context of this case, but there were lots of things that kind of led to what eventually happened with Phil resigning. And so Holly Willoughby, for the first time in her adult life, was presenting this morning alone, or with whoever ITV could bring in to kind of prop up the format. And at one time it was this presenter who still works there now called Josie, who is brilliant. But viewers couldn't help but notice that something was different with Holly. She looked tired, quieter, less polished. And behind the scenes, something was different. Because although all of this was going on with her life and much of it the public knew about, there was someone, somewhere, who had been watching Holly Willoughby for a very long time. Not as a fan, not as a viewer, but as a target. It was in October of 2023 that Holly put a post up on her Instagram. Quote, "I have let ITV know today that after 14 years I will not be returning to This Morning. To everyone who has ever worked on the show over the years, thank you so much. This is such a difficult goodbye. You are incredible and I forever will be proud of what we've done together. I will not be returning to This Morning. Thank you to everyone at ITV for being supportive. To every guest who has sat on our sofa, thank you. Most of all, thank you to the wonderful viewers. You've been so loyal, so supportive, and the very best company every day." Richard and Judy said, "We only look after this show. It will always belong to the viewers. It's been an honour to just be part of its story, and I know this story has many chapters left to go. Sadly, however, I now feel I have to make this decision for me and my family. I will miss you all so much. Holly." Viewers of This Morning had noticed that a little while earlier, a few days earlier, even though during her latest appearance on the show, Holly had said, quote, "see you tomorrow," she'd never actually come back on air and no one really knew what was going on. And with this Instagram post now confirming that she was going to be leaving the show, it got people questioning what was really going on. There were, of course, rumours of it being because of Phil's scandal and him leaving, but the fact she'd been there for some time after he'd left meant other viewers think that wasn't true. There were other reasons people came up with as to why she'd left, but the reality of it was far darker and more terrifying than anyone could have guessed. Because not long before that statement, Holly had been swarmed at her home by tens of police officers. They had come to tell her they needed her to stay put, and they were going to explain everything, but for now, she was going to be under armed guard supervision at her home. They had a man in custody on suspicion of planning to abduct, rape, and murder her. The man's name was Gavin Plumb. It was October 3rd, 2023, 3 days before Holly Willoughby vanished from our screens. And this man, Gavin Plumb, posted something to a private chat group on the messaging app Kik. From my understanding, it's a little bit like WhatsApp, but it's encrypted. I think WhatsApp is encrypted now too, but I think Kik was one of the first messaging services to do this, so it was seen as really secure. The messages that Gavin had sent on that day were 4 photographs of Holly, candid, personal, clearly taken with disturbing intent when we know the context, and alongside them, quote, "the one in the public eye I want." To the outside world, Gavin Plumb was nobody special. He didn't have any friends, no real deep connections, but in this group, he was about to be someone. Another user replied with a single word, "nice." This user's name was David Nelson. David was someone Gavin had actually never spoken to before, but now the floodgates were open. Gavin messaged again, and this time it was worse. He boasted about knowing everything. When Holly did and didn't have security, that she didn't have CCTV at home, and even what time she woke up in the morning. He wasn't just fantasizing, he was surveilling her. David Nelson slid into Gavin's private messages. Maybe out of curiosity, Gavin would have thought. Maybe something darker. Over the next 30 hours, the two exchanged more than 300 messages. And through that bizarre, disturbing back and forth, Gavin learned something. David Nelson lived in the United States. He actually had no idea who Holly Willoughby was. He asked Gavin why he'd posted her in an abduction group, and Gavin replied with a single skin-crawling question. This was an abduction group, after all, so, quote, "why do you think?" That's when police would discover what Gavin Plumb had really been planning. But to really understand what led to that moment, we have to go back 2 years before Holly Willoughby even appeared on his radar. Back to Harlow, Essex, back to a lonely, angry boy named Gavin. Gavin Plumb was born on the 25th of February 1987. He was raised by his mother and stepfather in a quiet corner of Essex, and Gavin grew up as the big kid, the kind of person that other kids targeted. He was teased and bullied and isolated, and instead of learning to cope, Gavin learned to blame. Everything wrong in his life was someone else's fault. The bullies, his teachers, his family, the girls who didn't look at him, the people who made fun of him, and eventually, the strangers on TV living lives he believed should have been his. When Gavin was 18, he met someone who, for a brief moment, made him feel seen. Her name was Laura Roberts, and their paths first crossed when they were teenagers. Gavin used to come by her family's home to play with her younger sister. He was younger than Laura, quiet, polite. Quote, "I thought he was kind and sweet." But that kindness didn't last. Once they were together, Gavin quickly revealed the kind of man he really was. He controlled Laura's finances, told her that no one else would ever want her and that she needed him. It was emotional abuse, textbook, but what really happened after that is that it escalated into something even darker. He started to hit her, slap her, kick her body, laugh as she would just kind of cower in fear in the corner. Laura said, quote, "As I'd cower in the corner, he would smirk and laugh as he stood over me. He seemed to enjoy it when I was scared." After she gave birth to their son, the violence got worse. Laura feared not only for herself, but also for her child. She knew she had to get out, and fast. She turned to the only people she could, her family and the police. She got her son and she did escape, but shortly after that, she discovered she was pregnant again. What Laura couldn't have known, what no one knew, was that Gavin's actions, his violence towards her, that was just the beginning. Before Gavin Plumb ever mentioned Holly Willoughby, before Kik, and before the dark web fantasy groups, there was Maria. As is often the case on Red Rum, we're using pseudonyms where, in this case, the woman said she didn't want to be associated in any way with Gavin. She gave herself this name in one of the articles, so I'm going to use it. It was in 2006 that Maria, a young cabin crew worker, was on her usual commute to the airport in Stansted. She chose a quiet seat at the back of the train to do her hair and makeup. The carriage was almost empty, but then a man entered and sat directly opposite her. She thought it was odd. Of all the seats, empty seats, why would he sit there? And look, if you are a woman, you've probably been here. The amount of times I've been on public transport and a random man has chosen to sit right next to me rather than in one of the other tens of unoccupied seats. It happens. Although, and this is actually a really terrifying thought, that happened to me a lot when I was younger, but it's happened a lot less as I've gotten older. I think it mainly happened when I was in like my early 20s or more so my late teens, which is very telling and grim. Anyway, this woman, Maria, she barely glanced up when the man across from her slid a piece of paper across the table. She had assumed it was rubbish, but he nudged it closer, insistent. When she finally read it, her blood ran cold. Quote, "I have got a gun. All you have to do is keep quiet. Do what I say, so just stand up and get off at the next stop with me. Don't cry or make a sound. Don't stop me from touching you because I won't hurt you. If you do all of this, no one will get hurt. But if you don't, I am going to shoot you and myself and everybody else." Maria looked up, properly this time, and saw the man clearly. Quote, "My first impression was I have no chance." Gavin Plumb had a rope. He had a replica gun, which of course she didn't know at the time, she would have thought it was real, and he had this plan. He reached across, placing a hand on her knee, silently motioning for her to stand up and follow him. The next station was in a rural village surrounded by woods. It was empty and most importantly isolated. Maria's mind raced through the worst possible scenarios. Quote, "If I get off this train, he can do anything." Frozen at first and then terrified, she made a desperate, silent plea for help, locking eyes with another female passenger. And that woman, thankfully, recognised the danger instantly. She ran to the front of the carriage and brought back a male passenger, and together they moved towards Maria. Now Gavin saw them coming and he bolted. He fled the train as soon as it stopped at that station and disappeared. But that wasn't the end of it. He was not done. Days later, he tried to do the same thing again, this time targeting another woman. Just like Maria, she was wearing her airline uniform. And I don't really know what this is about. I couldn't find anything concrete on that other than him having this kind of odd fantasy. Like, there's nothing in his background or any other examples of this in his life, but he's targeting someone who works as an air hostess now for a second time. But thankfully, just like Maria, this other woman did manage to escape. When questioned, Gavin later told the court he did have a stewardess fantasy. But here's where things took a truly infuriating turn. Because despite attempting to kidnap 2 women, despite threatening to kill himself and others, and despite being caught with a rope and a replica weapon, Gavin Plumb did not go to prison. He was caught, but he was just given a suspended 12-month sentence. He walked free. When men are allowed to get away with stuff like this, of course they're going to go on to progress, to make their plans more sturdy and to go on to do more harm to women. Maria went on later to say, quote, "I believe that lack of punishment was only encouragement." And she was right, because he did try again. In 2008, he was working as a security guard at Woolworths when he spotted 2 16-year-old girls in the shop. What happened next was calculated, premeditated, and terrifying. He led them into the back storeroom, pulled out a knife, and told one of them, "Get to the back of the storeroom." Then, with chilling calm, he began to tie their wrists. This wasn't his fantasy anymore. This was Gavin Plumb in action, doing exactly what he'd described in dark internet forums and private chats. And if it hadn't been for one of the girls managing to escape and raise the alarm, there's no telling how far he would have gone. Gavin was arrested and held on remand. Just before this incident, Gavin and his ex, the mother of his children, Laura, had reunited. Gavin had convinced her that none of the accusations were true, but with these two new allegations from these two 16-year-old girls, Laura was now in shock. Quote, "He denied it and I desperately tried to believe him. I had to take our two young children to visit him in prison, but once the trial started the following year, there was no room left for hope." Quote, "I attended every day and straight away it was crystal clear that the girls were telling the truth. He was a lying, sadistic monster." Gavin was found guilty and sentenced to just over 2.5 years, but like before, he didn't serve it all. He was released in 2010, having served just half of his sentence. This man is now a repeat offender. He's clearly a dangerous person, and yet now he's out, free. Laura was terrified. She lived in constant fear that he'd track her down, that he'd turn his obsession towards her, that he'd try and take the kids. Finally, in 2013, she decided enough was enough. She packed up her life, took the children, and moved from Essex to Great Yarmouth, desperate to leave the past behind. There, she built a new life. She met a new partner, she had 2 more children, and for a while, years in fact, she didn't hear from Gavin Plumb again. But Gavin hadn't gone quiet. He was waiting, because the thing that had always fueled him, the thing he once called his, quote, ultimate fantasy, was still burning in the background. And her name was, of course, Holly Willoughby. By 2018, Gavin Plumb was 31 years old and weighed in at 35.5 stone. That's over 220 kilograms. Just hearing that number really doesn't do it justice, but to put it plainly, it's severely life-limiting. He couldn't work, he couldn't walk more than a few steps, and most days he couldn't even leave his 1-bedroom flat in Harlow, Essex. For 4 years, Gavin barely stepped outside. The furthest he ever got was to put the bins out. Bins that, according to neighbours, were bursting at the seams. And long before anyone would hear his name in connection to kidnap plots or celebrity targets, the BBC had taken an interest in Gavin Plumb. In 2018, a journalist named Joanna Ing published an interview with Gavin, one that cast him in a very different light. At that point, Gavin wasn't known as a danger to the public. He was just a deeply obese man speaking openly about his pain, isolation, and his mental health struggles. In his own words, quote, "I don't like sitting around and doing nothing. I want to go back to work. I want to kick a football around, but physically, I can't do it." Gavin described how his weight had crept up after he lost his job and stopped playing Sunday League football. The more weight he gained, the more depressed he became, and the more he ate to cope. It was a vicious cycle and he couldn't seem to break it. Quote, "When I'm in pain, the pain gets so bad that it's physically crippling. I'm scared that if I have something to eat or if I move too much, that's it, I'm done." He said it took 4 people to help get him down the stairs to attend medical appointments, and his parents worried constantly. His mum, especially, that one day they'd come over and find him dead on the floor. Eventually, a concerned doctor referred him for gastric sleeve surgery, and in April 2018, Gavin went under the knife. In a follow-up BBC piece, he spoke about the experience. The surgery was painful, the recovery slow, but it had worked. Just 10 days after the operation, he'd already lost 22 pounds. Within 2 months, he'd gone from 5XL clothes to 3XL. For the first time in years, he could stand and make a cup of tea without pain. It was emotional and, for him, felt empowering. And Gavin did make progress. He stuck to the post-op diet, joined support groups, and gradually rebuilt enough strength to function again. Quote, "It doesn't take a struggle to get out of bed anymore. I feel happy with myself. I still don't like the way I look, but I know that will come with time." It was a turning point. He started applying for jobs. He talked about getting back into football. And he told the BBC he just wanted people to know that overweight people aren't lazy, that some of them just need help. And for a while, It seemed like Gavin had finally found that help. After losing around 10 stone, he managed to secure a job as a security guard at the Pinnacle shopping centre in Harlow. He was getting out of the house, he was kind of blending back into society, and from the outside, Gavin looked like a man putting his life back together, but behind the scenes, the fantasies hadn't gone anywhere. He'd just been quiet, waiting, watching, planning. On Tuesday the 3rd of October 2023, Gavin was logged into a public group chat on the Kik messaging app. Now, while chat group or messaging app might sound innocuous, this one was anything but. It was called Abduct Lovers. This wasn't a place for fantasy, roleplay, or edgy humour. It was a gathering point for users who shared disturbing interests: abduction, rape, torture, human trafficking, and murder. Targets discussed included ex-partners, colleagues, neighbours, and even celebrities, and the group had around 100 members. The profile picture of the group showed a distressed young blonde woman, a man's hand clamped tightly over her mouth. Gavin's own profile on Kik used an image of TV presenter Holly Willoughby. His username was BigBear341987. Later on, he would admit to being a regular in the Abduct Lovers group, but when asked exactly how long he'd been part of it, he either couldn't or wouldn't say. One of the men Gavin was speaking to in that group was a man called Mark Mulligan. To his neighbours in northwest Dublin, Mulligan seemed like a recluse. He lived quietly with a female relative in a housing estate near a school. He kept to himself. But when word got out about who he really was, about what he'd done, residents staged a protest outside his home and Mulligan fled soon after. In November 2014, Mulligan was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison after he stalked a woman for 4 years and fantasised out loud about her child. When police searched his home, they discovered child abuse images and transcripts of graphic conversations in which Mulligan talked in explicit detail about raping and torturing children. Mulligan, then 39, admitted to police that he'd built an entire fantasy world online because he was lonely. But what began as escapism quickly became something darker. He pleaded guilty to harassing a woman between 2008 and 2012, and to possession of child abuse material in 2013. He was also found guilty, after just 44 minutes of jury deliberation, of producing abuse images through his online conversations, which often involved threats against celebrities, journalists, and their children. One of those conversations involved Mulligan sending a woman a photo of a dismembered doll, along with a violent message as part of his so-called fantasy. In another online chat, he said he would, quote, love to rape a 3-year-old boy simply because his mother had pissed him off. When the other person in the conversation suggested, quote, let's snatch him, Mulligan responded, fueling a shared fantasy of brutal violence and control. He later said that it was all just sick fantasy and he had no intention of acting on any of it, but for his victims, the impact was devastating. The woman who Mulligan had harassed first went to police in 2008. She was receiving late-night texts and emails from him, messages that grew darker and more threatening over time. He even stole images of her child from social media, and he set up fake accounts pretending to be people she knew. At sentencing, Judge Patricia Ryan ordered Mulligan to stay away from the woman and her family for 30 years. He was also ordered to comply with probation services for 18 months after his release and engage in treatment or rehabilitation as required. Despite the conversations, despite the surveillance, and despite his known history of stalking and fantasising about violence, Mark Mulligan was once again online, deep in chat rooms, exchanging messages with people like Gavin Plumb. During the trial, jurors were shown over 900 WhatsApp messages exchanged between Gavin and Mark Mulligan. Their conversations spanned 18 months, from December 2021 to June 2023, and in them, Gavin shared thousands of images of Holly. Many were genuine photos, but some were deep fakes, AI manipulated pornographic images where Holly's face was superimposed onto the bodies of bound, gagged, naked women. The messages were so graphic, so vile that they actually weren't read aloud in court. But the jury did get copies so that they could read all of them. And I saw some of them in one of the documentaries. And Gavin's texts are disgusting. In one of them, he says, quote, "She's going to be obeying our every want and need." In these chats with Mark, Gavin also talked logistics. They discussed chloroform, restraints, abduction routines. Gavin even sent Mark the same video of his restraint kit that he later sent to David. On the 14th of May, he sent images of imitation firearms available for purchase. When investigators entered Gavin Plumb's one-bedroom flat in Harlow, Essex, they had no idea exactly what kind of darkness they were about to unearth. What they discovered inside was disturbing. What they found, this kind of scribbled on single sheet of paper, and they realised very quickly it was a list. It was handwritten, it was 1.5 pages long, and it was crammed with names. 136 of them, all women, all celebrities. And at the top of that list was Holly Willoughby. This wasn't some fan's daydream, this was a kill list, a blueprint. And Holly wasn't just at the top, she was the focus. For 2.5 years, Gavin had been meticulously planning her abduction, rape, and murder. And he broadcast this. He had to do this because he was hunting for accomplices. One of them he thought he'd finally found, a man called David Nelson. They met in that chat group Abduct Lovers on Kik, and from the moment their messages began, Gavin made it clear he wasn't playing games. He'd already identified Holly's home address. He sent David a Google Maps screenshot of it. He explained that he'd been studying her house, looking for access points, escape routes, weak spots. He'd done a reconnaissance of the journey between her house and his own. He was planning a nighttime home invasion, and he wanted David to help. Gavin told David that others he'd approached had backed out, they'd got cold feet, but he was willing to go it alone if necessary. He discussed kidnapping Holly, using chloroform to subdue her and her husband, dragging her into her own car, which he would steal, and then driving back to his flat in Harlow. From there, the plan was to take her to an abandoned building. He even discussed dates for the abduction, flights from New York where David lived, possible third-party drivers, because Gavin didn't actually have a license. He said that wasn't going to stop him. Come on, man, you can't even drive. How are you going to do all of this? Potentially alone as well, like he'd already said he was prepared to do. This man is ridiculous. But that doesn't change the fact that, especially with the right resources, he would be extremely dangerous. He was committed. To prove his seriousness, he sent David photos of the restraint kit he'd prepared. It included handcuffs, ankle restraints, gags, an eye mask, ropes, and metal cable ties. Some of those tools he'd had for over a year. The ropes from February 2022, the cable ties from April of that same year. He also showed David 2 bottles he said were chloroform, which he'd bought online. He'd researched the chemical's legality and effectiveness. Now later analysis would show that the bottles actually only contained ethanol and water, but the point is Gavin believed it was real. He even bought a utility folding knife on August 1st, 2023 to use during the attack. At one point, David pushed him, asking if this was just talk or something real, and Gavin replied, "Definitely serious for me anyway." And then came the most terrifying exchange of all. Gavin and David arranged to send each other live videos. This was so that they both knew they were who they said they were. In the footage, they each said the same date, 3rd of October 2024, and a code word, Holly. It was their sick pledge, their contract. Gavin believed his plan was finally in motion, but what he didn't know was that David Nelson wasn't David Nelson at all. He was an undercover police officer based in Minnesota, and for the past 3 years, David had worked to infiltrate online spaces used for various crimes: human trafficking, murder for hire, rape, and other violent conspiracies. As soon as he'd read Gavin's messages in that group, his alarm bells rang. This wasn't just dark fantasy, this was a man preparing to act. And David then began asking questions, pushing for details to assess the threat. Everything Gavin said confirmed it. This wasn't talk, this was reality. Gavin also spoke about getting Holly to video an agreement saying that she's come with them under her own free will and was fully consenting, quote, so that covers us. Wild. In one message, David asked if Holly was going to be returned and Gavin replied, no. Later, when asked what would happen after they were done, Gavin messaged back, quote, slit her throat, clean her out and dispose of her. He planned to wash her body in bleach and then dump it in a lake. It was cold, meticulous, depraved. And he wasn't done. At one point, Gavin claimed he had a practice victim. He claimed he could practice on this woman who lived nearby before executing his plans against Holly. And he even sent photos of the woman to David, suggesting that he'd been monitoring her. Now, there's no evidence that he acted on those threats, and the woman did remain unharmed, but that aspect of Gavin's behaviour really underscores the kind of calculated and dangerous nature of his crimes. They extended far beyond fantasy, and they were real-world targets for these individuals. He also made this really disturbing claim that the judge speaks about in his closing remarks, and it's that his 15-year-old son might want to be involved. Gavin even sent David a photo of his son, and police later found no evidence that the child knew anything about his father's plans, but Gavin's suggestion alone that his son could be weaponised as leverage against Holly was a level of psychopathy that left detectives reeling. And then there was his boasting. He wanted David to know he wasn't bluffing, that he had done this before, and he told him about his prior convictions. One in 2006 where he attempted to kidnap those two women on the train, and the one in 2008 with the two girls at the Woolworths. He was proud of it as if it was a CV for what he could do. Gavin Plumb really believed he'd found his perfect partner in David Nelson, but that illusion shattered the moment the door to his flat burst open, because Gavin hadn't just been talking to a fellow predator as he believed, he'd been talking to the very person who would bring him down. Meanwhile, while all of this had been going on in the background, Gavin wasn't done with his harassment of other women, probably feeling really empowered by the conversations he was having with other people like Mark Mulligan. It was in June 2023 that Gavin tracked down Laura Roberts, his ex, the mother of his children. He travelled over 100 miles to find her in her new seaside home. Quote, I didn't see him, but he sent me vile messages on Facebook. He even threatened to hurt our kids. The police arrested him, but let him go, and I was scared of what he might do next. This seemed to catapult Gavin's plan forward, and we know what he did next. The arrest happened quickly. No sirens, no resistance. They smashed the door in and found him in his bedroom in his flat in Harlow on the 4th of October 2023, where we started this case. The reason they forcibly enter is because they're worried that if he gets any kind of heads up, then maybe he'll delete stuff off of his phone or he might try and kill himself. What officers found inside the flat wasn't just disturbing, it was meticulously staged horror. On the floor of his living room was what police later described as that kill kit. Inside they found zip ties, knives, heavy-duty gloves, the chloroform, or what he thought was chloroform, handcuffs and rope, and a burner phone, preloaded with private conversations and detailed notes on what was to happen next. Is why we know so much and have such detail, because officers managed to confiscate that phone. The judge's sentencing remarks are available to read in full online or on YouTube. Here's some of what he said. Quote, you made it clear that you were planning a nighttime home invasion of that address and that you'd been studying access points and other practicalities. David Nelson asked if you were looking for help, and you made it clear that you'd welcome it. You even fixed some dates for the commission of the offences within a few days of the conversation with David Nelson. The plan was for you to take her to your flat initially and then to an abandoned building. You talked about the use of chloroform to incapacitate Mrs. Willoughby and her husband, And then you sent David Nelson photos of bottles you bought online. You sent David Nelson a video showing him your restraint kit. You told David Nelson that you planned to use the knives in the attack, including kitchen knives and a utility folding knife. Your plan was hopelessly unrealistic for a number of reasons, including your poor physical health, but you clearly thought it was feasible. Although you talked about carrying out the plan on your own, I'm sure this was simply bravado. You always intended to carry out your plan to kidnap, rape, and kill Mrs. Willoughby, but only if you could find the right man or men, the right crew, as you sometimes called it, to help you do it. That was one of the principal purposes of your participation in the Abduct Lovers Kick group and other online chat groups. After years of frustration, talking about your plan online with a number of others, you thought you finally found in David Nelson someone who would really help you. At one point, you said, quote, "It's actually happening." Unfortunately for you, David Nelson was an undercover police officer based in Minnesota. David Nelson is not his real name, but I will continue to use it in sentencing remarks. I permitted him to give his evidence anonymously during trial to protect his personal safety and that of his family, as well as to protect the public interest by preserving his ability to continue his important undercover work. David's rapid professional assessment was that your messages were of a different order and revealed a real danger. During the trial, the jury had all of your private kick messages and David Nelson in a document entitled The Sequence of Events. It is clear early on during that exchange that your plan was to kidnap, rape, and otherwise sexually abuse Miss Willoughby. The police found that you had downloaded millions of images. They were only able to view about 10% of the total. They found thousands upon thousands of images of Miss Willoughby, including not only genuine images of her, but also deep fake porn images. You claim in your evidence that you had only brought the chloroform to clean a stubborn stain on your living room carpet, and that was a particularly clumsy and obvious lie. At various times during your WhatsApp exchanges with Mark, you discussed looking for an abandoned property outside of London where you could hold Mrs. Willoughby. On one occasion in June 2022, you forwarded to Mark a photograph that had been sent to you of a room on an abandoned stud farm that you thought might be suitable for this purpose. One particularly deeply unpleasant aspect of your exchanges with Mark, which did not appear in your exchanges with David Nelson, was your discussion of restraining Miss Willoughby's children and using her fear for their safety as leverage with which to control her. End quote. On the 3rd of April 2024, Gavin Plumb stood in the dock at Chelmsford Crown Court. He wasn't smiling. Gone was the online bravado, the theatrical cruelty he'd so easily dished out behind a screen. Now, he was silent. He was found guilty of 2 charges, soliciting to commit murder and inciting to commit rape. And then came the statements. Prosecutors described a plot that had crossed every conceivable boundary, fantasy bleeding into logistics, sadism dressed as organisation. Gavin had given the American accomplice, the undercover officer, clear instructions on where to enter Holly Willoughby's home, what to bring, what to do to her. It was methodical and cold, designed not just to hurt her, but to destroy her. And Holly wasn't actually in court, fair blood enough, but her voice was there. In a victim impact statement that hasn't been made public through Holly's request, that was given to Gavin, a copy of it, and of course the essential courtgoers heard it as well. And after that, the judge didn't hold back. He called Gavin's plan grotesque, said it was a crime driven by hate and entitlement, a plan which would have ended nothing short of agony. He described Gavin as a man whose obsession had become violent and whose ability to turn people into objects, props for his own gratification, was nothing short of terrifying. And then came the sentence. Gavin Plumb was given a life sentence. He will serve a minimum of 15 years. If and when Gavin is released, he will be subject to licence conditions for the whole of his life. The judge said Gavin posed an ongoing risk to the public, especially to women, that while he hadn't physically harmed anyone yet, his preparations were so advanced, so calculated that it was only luck and law enforcement that stopped him in time. As Gavin was led away, he muttered that he had 15 years to kill himself. And that is the case of Gavin Plumb, a man who tried to turn his grotesque fantasies into reality and almost succeeded, or at least partially. It's easy to write people like him off as loners or keyboard warriors or trolls, but I think what this case shows brutally is that the internet can become a weapon in the hands of someone who genuinely, horrifyingly believes that women are nothing more than targets. In Holly's case, the police acted fast, but this wasn't a near miss. It was a direct hit on everything we think keeps us safe. Our homes, our privacy, even our anonymity. This case isn't just about one man's twisted plan. It's about the culture that enables it. The dark corners of the web where people egg each other on, the forums that dress up violence as entertainment, and the real women who live with the consequences. So, stay aware, trust your gut, and remember, if something feels wrong, say something, because silence is where men like Gavin Plumb thrive. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Red Rum. I spoke very briefly about this last week, but I now have the link to the event. So I wanted to remind you guys that Naomi Channel from the podcast Reel is doing a 24-hour live event to raise money for victim support. So she's going to be live streaming for 24 hours. She's going to be talking to lots of true crime experts. She's going to be talking to true crime podcasters, to family members of victims of true crime events, and I am going to be joining her on the Sunday at 9 a.m. So that's this coming Sunday. There is a link to my specific showing in the show notes, and also to the Just Giving page where you can donate, and you can also find out the full lineup and what other time other people are on. I'm sure you will have heard of some of the guests and some of the other podcasters, especially because there's a whole array of us. And it's going to be a really, really interesting show and raising money for a really, really important cause for victim support. So I'll leave all that information in the description box below. And other than that, I'll see you guys on Monday. Bye.